Glenn Kimball on Melchizedek. Someone should have, a very long time ago, created a playbill for the Holy Bible. The playbill is much like a menu listing the characters, how they might relate to each other, and perhaps a little bit of the story. How can we possibly argue the minutiae of the Bible theology when we can't even identify the players? You see, the Bible is a composite of many different books written by many different authors, and each of the characters may appear in different books under different names, and sometimes within the same book. For example, there are many different Marys in the Bible. It's easy to identify the Virgin Mary, or Mary the wife of the carpenter, or Mary the mother of Jesus. However, who is Mary of James, Mary of Joses, and Mary the mother of Salome? In each of those three cases, we're also talking about the Virgin Mary. These three children, James, Joses, and Salome, all at one time had been siblings of the Virgin Mary. It gets much more complicated when we talk about Mary of Cleophas, because scholars have sometimes even intimated that this Mary was her own sister. But Mary of Cleophas was not the Virgin Mary. It was another Mary, a stepsister of Jesus by another marriage. There are groups who contend that their religions are based correctly on identifying the real name of Jesus. Is it Jesus? Is it Yahweh? Is it Jehovah? How can these faiths be so adamant about the correct name of Christ when they can't even identify the rest of the players in the Bible? Let's go back for a moment and identify who might be the siblings of Jesus. We note in Matthew 13, 55 and 56, and I read, "Is this not the carpenter's son?" Obviously referring to Jesus. "Is this not his mother called Mary, and his brethren James and Joses and Simon and Judas?" And in verse 56, "And his sisters, are they not all with us?" We have scholars today that assume that when we say the word brethren, we're talking in a familiar sense, like calling someone bro or brother, when in reality this passage is literally referring to siblings of Jesus. Let's talk about those various siblings. James being one of the principal ones. But then again, we have many different James. We have James the son of Zebedee. We have James the son of Alphaeus, or probably Cleophas, the brother-in-law of the Virgin Mary. We have James the son of the Virgin Mary. We have James the son of the carpenter. Those two easily identified. James the brother of John, who is also a son of Zebedee. James the brother of Jesus, that one's easy. James the Less, which is also probably the brother of Jesus, the son of the carpenter. James the Just, who is also probably the brother of Jesus and the carpenter. There appear to be three people by the name of James if we look at it in this fashion. However, it is most likely that James, the son of Cleophas, was really the son of the carpenter. Eisenman, the one who is the expert in the field on the brothers of Jesus from his book, James, the brother of Jesus, is still operating under the assumption that Joseph the carpenter had not been married before and left a widower when his wife died. And then by the time he married the Virgin Mary, had 4 children. However, the Vatican itself and the heads of the Episcopal faith admitted in their public portrait of the Virgin Mary that they have evidence that Joseph the carpenter was married before, and they believed him to be a widower when he met the Virgin Mary. Then there is the critical apocryphal book written by Matthew entitled Gospel of the Virgin Mary, which tells the story of the widower Joseph. Some have suggested that this book is a lie. However, this is the very book used by the Vatican and the heads of the Episcopal faith to verify that Joseph had been a widower. They obviously place a great deal of value in its authenticity, though the rest of Western Christianity does not. Of course, the Vatican has preserved an ancient copy of this document, and the rest of Western Christianity has never been in that library to know for themselves. Things get even more complicated when we look at Thomas, the brother of Jesus. He's known as Judas, the brother of Jesus, in Matthew 13, 55 and 56. He's also called Judas, the brother of James, in Luke and Acts. He's known as Jude, or Judas, the brother of Simon, who was the older brother of Jesus. Eusebius calls Thomas Judas, Didymus, Thomas in that order. Eusebius was the archbishop under Constantine at the time of the Nicene Council. The Greek and the Syriac versions of the Bible also add the name Didymus, or twin, to the name of Thomas, though Thomas really wasn't the twin of Christ, but rather the look-alike brother. The Nag Hammadi uses the name Didymus Judas Thomas, just reversing those two names. The Syriac version uses the name Doubting Thomas to refer to the brother of Jesus. And Thomas is also known as Judas, who preached the truth to the Essenes. The Apostolic Constitutions call Thomas Judas the Zealot. The Islamic Talmud calls Thomas Hud, or the brother of the righteous one. In Hebrew, we get the name Yehuda, or Judas. In the Aramaic, we get the name Saleh, or the righteous one. Now things get really complicated when we consider Joses as the younger sibling of Jesus, listed in Matthew 13, 55 and 56 once again. Eisenman says that Joses is merely Jesus named as one of his own brothers, like Mary is listed as her own sister. He says that there's too little evidence to suggest that Joses was a separate person. However, Matthew clearly lists Joses as a separate person. We can get a better idea who Joses is when he is named at the scene of the burial of Jesus. 3 women come to the tomb of Jesus, owned by Joseph of Arimathea. Mary Magdalene, probably the wife of Jesus. Certainly she has something to do with the burial of Christ. Salome, probably the older stepsister of Jesus, and also the probable midwife at the birth of Jesus. Then we have Mary of Joses, who clearly is the Virgin Mary, who is still caring for her youngest son, Joses. Joses is clearly named after Joseph the carpenter, unlike Jesus. Then again, Joses appears on the ship manifest at the Exodus of the faithful with Joseph of Arimathea, the Virgin Mary, Mary Magdalene, the Bethany sisters, Lazarus, Cassius Longinus, the one who lanced the sight of Jesus with his spear and was healed by the blood of Jesus from his pending blindness, and lastly, Joses. This Joses is later called Barnabas by others. The only brother left to describe is the oldest stepbrother of Christ, called Simon. He's also called Simon the Zealot in the Bible. Now there are other characters that are confusing too. Certainly Joseph of Arimathea appears under different names. He's called the rich merchant. He's called the guardian for the body of Christ. He's called the merchant of Alban in the apocryphal Acts of Thomas. And he's also called the foster father of Jesus. No wonder we get confused when we see all the different names for the various characters in the Holy Bible. No wonder we disagree on the dogma when we can't even get the characters straight. The problem even gets more complex than this. Some of the most important characters mentioned in the Bible are mentioned least in the Bible. This is certainly the case with Melchizedek. Melchizedek is the second most important prophet in the Bible. We know this for several reasons. First of all, the great Abraham, who was the father of both the Hebrew nation and of Islam, paid his tithing to the great king, priest, prophet Melchizedek out of respect for who Melchizedek was. Secondly, Jesus was a member of the order of Melchizedek. Jesus wasn't a part of any other movement mentioned in the Bible. Then comes a mysterious question. Are there characters in the Bible that appear at different times, but are in reality the same person? What would cause a character to appear at one time in the Bible and then appear some other time earlier in the Bible or in other literature? Is the Bible wrong? Are the separate records wrong in their dating? Or is there some other reason? Could it be that some of the characters span time beyond the course of a normal life? To understand this better, we can look at some of the covenants God made with people. Certainly there were special families in the Bible. Some of them are referred to as the chosen people. What makes these families chosen? Is the bloodline that important, or is there something else that links the chosen together? Certainly each of the families of the earth feels special. However, God clearly made covenants with people. And most of these covenants refer to a priesthood after the order of Aaron. This priesthood was called the lesser priesthood, or the priesthood of the law. However, the most important covenant and power of them all was a fraternal order mentioned alongside the name of Jesus himself in Hebrews 5 and 10, where Jesus is a prophet after the order of Melchizedek. It is a fraternal order not linked to families, as was the priesthood of the tribe of Levi. In order to fully understand, let's turn to Hebrews and figure this thing out. Hebrews 5, 4 through 7, and I'll read it for you. And verse 4, and no man taketh this honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron. Paul goes on to say in verse 5, referring to Jesus, so also Christ glorified not himself to be made a high priest. God called him to be a high priest prophet. Apparently, to be this caliber of prophet, one needed to be a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. In the very next verse, Paul said, as if he were quoting God speaking to Jesus, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Apparently, God had established a priesthood order designed for prophets like Melchizedek and like Jesus. In verse 7, there is something very strange said. This verse is referring to Melchizedek instead of Jesus. Paul said, he had offered up his prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death. Some people say that verse 7 refers to Jesus as well, but the printed bibliography in my Bible says that verse 7 doesn't refer to Jesus, but refers to Melchizedek. Besides, Jesus did die. How can someone be saved from death if he died? Doesn't sound like being saved at all. It appears that the rumor at the time of Jesus was that Melchizedek was saved from death. This priestly order had the power over death. Then in verse 10, it clearly says that Jesus was a prophet after the order of Melchizedek. Why didn't Paul say that Jesus was called because he was a Jew or the rightful descendant of a royal chosen family? He obviously had something else in his mind. Later in Hebrews, Paul redefines his explanation of Melchizedek. In Hebrews 7:15, he says, and it is yet far more evident, for that after the similitude of Melchizedek, there ariseth another priest, who is made not after the law of carnal commandment, but after the power of an endless life. For God testified, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Then in verse 23, he really hits the nail on the head when he says, and there truly were many priests, because they were not suffered to continue by reason of death. Why didn't Paul say that there were many priests who had the power of God to heal the sick, or to perform ordinances, or to lead the people, or to save souls? Why did he continue to speak of the fact that these priests survived death? You know, Now that we know that there were priests who survived death, where are these men? What have they been doing? Do they appear in our day? Do we have tales that we tell each other about these people who were undead? Do we have stories that we convey to each other? Do we have incidences where these people appear and disappear? Well, it is my belief that I met one of these individuals personally. Just after I had finished my first book and had the text complete, I was working at a restaurant. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. I was just cleaning up, getting ready to go home. I thought I'd lock the doors. However, in through the door walked a man who had the very strange blue in his eyes and looked at me with a familiar glance, and he sat down. And, trying to be polite, I said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "No, but I can help you." And I thought flippantly, "My goodness, I don't need insurance." And I said it straight to his face, "I don't need insurance." And this man with a grin on his face turned to me and said, "I don't mean insurance." He said, "We know you have written a book about Jesus." Earlier that evening, I'd been very sad because I thought to myself, who would read a book written by me about Jesus? Even though I had been prompted to write this book because of a near-death experience I had had, who would read this book written by me? There are tens of thousands of books written about Jesus. And here this gentleman said, "We don't want you to throw your book away." He continued and said, "When it is finished, many thousands of people will read it, and they will find hope and faith in their life." I was astonished. I backed up, and when I hit the back of the wall, I dropped everything in my hands, and as I bent over to pick it up and I stood up, the man was nowhere to be found. I went over to the door. The door was locked. He couldn't possibly have gotten out. How many of us have had a similar experience or know of someone who's had a similar experience with a person that you could shake hands with, you could touch them, they looked mortal, they came and performed a rescue, something wonderful had happened in your life and had been actuated by a person who came and appeared mysteriously, performed his task, and then disappeared. This last week I've done 2 radio shows specifically on this topic of Melchizedek. And as I began to talk about my own story of the undead, both of these radio hosts, who represented themselves both to be atheists, had tales of their own. They interrupted me. They told me, "My goodness, I've had a story too in my life." The first one said when he was very young, he said he'd been riding his bicycle in the woods, and beneath this great sign he'd gotten a flat tire. And he looked out into the field and he saw a cabin, and out came a man from the door who helped him fix his bike in record time. He thought that was very strange, but he got on his bike and he rode home. And he said, "I told my dad about this, and my dad was so grateful that someone had helped me that we went back to find this man and to thank him." When we found that sign in the street again, I looked off over to the sign underneath the hill and pointed to the direction where that cabin had been, and it wasn't there. There was no man who lived in a cabin next to that sign. Who was that man? The second host told me the story about how he had been driving down the road, and he'd parked his car, or at least stopped at a stop sign, when there came a knocking at his window. And he rolled down the window a little bit, and the man said, "Please help me. I'm lost, and my wife needs to get home. I need $30. This radio host had never given money in his life to anybody. But he said, "I felt obligated. I felt impressed." He says, For the first time in my life, I handed this man $30. And as I looked in my rearview mirror, I could see that there was a woman in there as well. And when I looked down at my speedometer and then looked back in my rearview mirror, that car was gone. He said, I turned around to try and find this man to make sure that he got gasoline in his tank, or to try and catch him if he was just using it for some other reason. And he pulled into this restaurant and asked the host, did you see a man who was trying to get gasoline here? And he looked up on the wall, and there was a picture of a man and his wife who had originated this particular restaurant. It was this very same man who had asked money of him just a short time before in the street. The common element in all of these stories we hear from everyone was that someone appeared from nowhere and did something miraculous and then disappeared again. I know we all want to be objective. Every time we hear something out of left field, we are programmed to dismiss it automatically. However, there is an innate problem with this kind of protocol, with dismissing it automatically. If we let our expectations dictate our understandings, we have defined the rest of the truth out of existence. We have prevented ourselves from having our own discoveries and our own adventures. We've all heard many times that people would believe if only they had a sign. History is filled with such suggestions. But what we really are asking for when we ask God to show us a sign is really something much more than we're able to explain. We're asking God and the heavens to pass a gauntlet of our own making. In other words, we would believe if we saw a miracle or something unexplained that we had predicted. It would fall into the category of coincidence if we hadn't predicted it. Somewhere deep inside of all of us, we want to control the unexplainable. Jesus said it best, that we must have eyes to see and ears to hear. We cannot dictate to the heavens the test in order for us to believe. He clearly suggests that we are missing the miracles from time to time right in front of our eyes. We are failing to understand things that are clearly within our ability to grasp. Our protocols are in the way of being able to see and being able to hear. History is filled with such miracles, but most of them have been dismissed over the centuries because they have appeared on the surface too preposterous to be true. The biggest problem with the Nicene Council itself, which chose Western Christianity's scriptures and redefined the very nature of God, was that they wouldn't or couldn't allow the truth to be true. The truth was much more than the Nicene Council could tolerate. The truth was that Jesus was much more than they allowed themselves to believe. Well, perhaps half the truth is better than none of the truth. However, Christianity has risen to be the strongest opponent of the expanded story of Jesus. The ones who pledge themselves to believe in the Messiah are the very ones who have been Jesus' biggest critics. The problem with Western Christianity isn't that they believe the wrong thing. The problem is that they can't allow themselves to believe the rest of the story. By limiting the parameters of the life of Christ with our assumptions, we miss the best of the tale. So it is with many ancient characters in the Bible, including Melchizedek. We have the same problem with the history of the United States. The great journals of history in our country will not accept submitted manuscripts about topics that predate 1492. They have legislated out of existence any part of history before 1492. Gunnar Thompson, my good friend, submitted his manuscript, The Friar's Map. He submitted his manuscript on other diffusionist topics, and all of them were turned down because they dealt with topics prior to Christopher Columbus landing in America. It seems to me, from a distance, that the only difference between Christopher Columbus and all the other people who came to the Americas looking for refuge, looking for gold, looking for drugs, looking for whatever thing they were doing here in the Americas, was that Christopher Columbus was the only one to stick a flag in the dirt and claim the Americas for a country in Europe. The rest of them were not so egotistical, not so vain. And perhaps we in this country and our historians have attempted to hide the fact that we have claimed this country erroneously by sticking a flag in the dirt and ignoring the people who are already here. Let's begin constructing this game. Let's begin at the beginning and find out if the real characteristics of Melchizedek from history. We ask the question, who are the most important historians on the subject of Melchizedek? Well, certainly Edersheim is one of the principal ones. He was the author of Jesus the Messiah and the Bible history that we have on the website at Ancient Manuscripts. Edersheim wrote his books in the early 1800s, and he used as his reference the great libraries of Cambridge and Oxford. Edersheim says, as the returning host of Abraham entered the valley of Sheba, close under the walls of what afterwards became the city of Jerusalem, they were met by two personages, bearing very different characteristics and coming from opposite directions. From the bank of the Jordan, the new king of Sodom and Gomorrah fame, whose predecessors had fallen in battle to Abraham, came up to thank Abraham and offer him their spoils. Abraham had won the battle of Canaan in the minds of these enemies, providing Abraham returned their servants taken in that battle. Abraham goes on to say, while from the heights of Salem, the ancient Jerusalem, the priest king Melchizedek descended to bless Abraham and to refresh him with bread and wine. This is the very first example in history recorded in the Bible of a Eucharist-like supper, the Last Supper. The custom in those days was to invite guests, especially noble conquering guests, to sup on sweetmeats and other delicious delicacies as may be available during different seasons of the year. However, on this special, unique occasion, Melchizedek offers to Abraham the refreshment of bread and wine like they are refreshing an ancient covenant of their people. Perhaps it would be helpful to find characters in history that use symbols of the Eucharist, such as the Grail used to refresh covenants between kings and nations and God himself. This memorable meeting, Edersheim says, seems to have given the valley containing the city of Jerusalem its name. The name is the King's Dale, because it was the meeting place of Abraham and the king Melchizedek, and the subsequent meeting sites for other significant events between kings. Edersheim then says something very strange. He says Melchizedek appears like a meteor from the sky, suddenly, unexpectedly, mysteriously, and then suddenly disappears. In order to try and find the complete works of Melchizedek, we must follow the protocol set by Edersheim. We're now looking for a man who comes and goes at will. Death apparently is no longer a barrier to Melchizedek. He may come and go beyond the restrictions of a normal life. Edersheim speaks of another person whose name is suspiciously like that of Melchizedek. His name was Adonizedek, very close to Melchizedek. Adonizedek was the king of Jerusalem at the time of Joshua in Joshua 10:3. The element of Zadok in each name became a Canaanite deity, the deity of righteousness. Apparently, this deity of the Canaanites was named after Melchizedek. The name Melchizedek literally means the king of righteousness. The name Adonizedek merely means the Lord of righteousness. Both men had been ruler of Jerusalem or Salem. However, the change in name, according to Edersheim, clearly indicates a change in dynasties. The real difference between these two men with the same ending to their name was that one was a king, prophet, and priest, and the other was a mere magistrate. The Midrash suggests that Adonizedek was Melchizedek. Maybe he was. However, Edersheim has a point. Perhaps we should consider Adonizedek a better candidate if he had been all three, prophet, priest, and king. Let's continue with the legacy of Melchizedek. It's continued in Psalms 110:4. This psalm was probably composed for the use of the enthronement of David himself and that of his successors. King David is promised an endless priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. Here again, we find a prophet, a priest, and a king. Strangely, Edersheim then argues that from the silence of the records respecting the parentage of Melchizedek's birth and death, it describes him as without father or mother or genealogy and without beginning of days or end of life, but resembling the Son of God. Then Edersheim says it affirms him to have been greater than Abraham since he blessed Abraham. For it is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the words of Edersheim, Melchizedek has no parents of record, no death, which makes him a very unusual man indeed. There are other prominent places that mention Melchizedek. For example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls from fragments found in Cave 11, Melchizedek was considered to have exalted status in the heavenly realm. From the Quran, we learn Melchizedek is associated with the deliverance of divine judgment, with the Day of Atonement that is connected with the last Jubilee, perhaps referring to Daniel's 7th week in Daniel's 9:24-27. However, like Melchizedek, his entire people disappeared. What happened to the people of Melchizedek? Well, Melchizedek had been allowed to enjoy the blessings of Enoch, says Skousen. Men having this faith, coming up to the order of God, were translated and taken up into heaven. And now Melchizedek was a priest of this order. Therefore he obtained peace in Salem, or Jerusalem, and was called the Prince of Peace. And his people wrought righteousness, obtaining heaven, and sought for the city of Enoch, which God had taken separately from the earth, having received it into the last days or the end of the world. That comes from the first 2,000 years, page 256. In Genesis 14:26, it reads, Now Melchizedek was a man of faith who wrought righteousness, and when a child he feared God and stopped the mouths of lions and quenched the violence of fire. And thus, having been approved of God, he was ordained a high priest after the covenant which God made with Enoch. Skousen goes on and he continues, the kingdom of Melchizedek in the land of Salem did not remain in existence for long. It was there when Abraham returned to Palestine from Egypt, but it appears to have been gone just a few years later. You will recall that after his battle with the kings, Abraham met with Melchizedek and honored him as a local presiding authority by paying tithing to him. This incident happened prior to the birth of Ishmael, which occurred when Abraham was about 86 years old. We know then that Melchizedek was ruling over the kingdom of Salem, or Jerusalem, up until about that time. However, by the time Abraham was nearing the age of 140 and in need to find a person of the proper lineage as wife for Isaac, there appears to have been none of the people of Melchizedek left. In fact, Abraham had to send all the way to Mesopotamia to get a wife for Isaac. Where had all these people of Melchizedek gone? Where did Melchizedek go after being king of Salem? There was an incident in Sodom
after the culture of Melchizedek was no more. Lot, son of Nahor, the brother of Abraham, had a visit of 3 men whom the Bible calls angels. These men were not shrouded in glory, as is the common case with the appearance of angels, but rather they appeared as other men. Lot recognized these men. They were not strangers to him. Is it possible that one of these men was in fact Melchizedek? These men were sent to lead Lot, to advise him, as would a king advise another head of state. Let's read about that story of the 3 angels from a very different source, the Jewish Midrash. Chapter 18, verse 3. And in the day Abraham went out of his tent and sat at the door to enjoy the heat of the sun during the pain of his flesh. And the Lord appeared to him in the plain of Mamre, and sent 3 of his administering angels to visit him. And he was sitting at the door of the tent, and he lifted up his eyes and saw, and lo, 3 men were coming from a distance. And he rose up and ran to meet them. And he bowed down to them and brought them into his house. Side note, just like he had done with Melchizedek. Verse 5, and he said to them, if now I have found favor in your sight, turn in and eat a morsel of bread. And he pressed them, and he turned in and gave them water, and they washed their feet. And he placed them under a tree at the door of the tent. And Abraham ran and took a calf tender and good, and he hastened to kill it. And he gave it to his servant Eleazar to dress. And Abraham came to Sarah into the tent, and he said to her, make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes to cover the pot containing the meat. And she did so. And Abraham hastened and brought before them butter and milk, beef and mutton, and gave it before them to eat before the flesh of the calf was sufficiently done. And they did eat. Side note, these men could eat and sup with Abraham. Verse 9, and when they were done eating, one of them said to him, I will return to thee according to the time of life, and Sarah, thy wife, shall have a son. And the men afterwards departed and went their ways to the places where they were sent. The Midrash goes on to say something very interesting, using a very different name for Melchizedek. From Jasher chapter 16, verse 10, and I quote, and Bera, king of Sodom, and the rest of his men that were with him, went out from the lime pits in which they had fallen to meet Abraham and his men. And Adonizedek, sounds very suspiciously like the Adonizedek from the Bible, king of Jerusalem, the same was Shem, obviously referring to Melchizedek, went out with his men to meet Abraham and his people with bread and wine, and they remained together in the valley of Melech, probably after the name Melchizedek. And Adonizedek blessed Abraham, and Abraham gave him 1/10 of all he had wrought from the spoils of his enemies, for Adonizedek was a priest before God. Obviously, this is not the same Adonizedek of Joshua, for if it is the same Adonizedek from the time of Joshua, we're talking about a difference of 600 years from the time of Joshua back to the time of Melchizedek. We get a little bit of the insight about Melchizedek from the book of Malachi. Now, Malachi said that the Son of Righteousness would rise with healing in his wings. That's Malachi 4:2. However, he has a very unusual spelling for the Son. It's S-U-N, Son of Righteousness, not S-O-N. Malachi was precluded from using the word son because that would have implied that the one who became Jesus was in fact Melchizedek. The term son would have suggested that Jesus was in some way a son or a descendant of Melchizedek. And remember, this Melchizedek and his power did not have to be passed on to children in order to be effective. Malachi said that the Son, or S-U-N, of righteousness would arise, and he meant that literally. Christ would descend from the sky, but before he descends, he would have to ascend. See Psalms 82 and 8. In Hebrews 3, Paul says that Melchizedek was without father or mother. He had no parents. Every human being, including Adam, has had a father. Refer to Luke 3:38. All the angels have the same father as Adam. They are referred to in many places in scriptures as sons, S-O-N, sons of God. The Most High God is the Father of Jesus. We can refer to Luke 1:32. Paul is clearly saying that Melchizedek, like the Most High God, was without parents, neither of them having beginning of days or end of life. The two of them had always lived, and there had never been a time that each of them had not lived. Melchizedek had always possessed inherent life. The prophet Micah had something to say about this, and I quote, "But you, Bethlehem, Ephratah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, out of you will come forth unto me one to be ruler of Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from eternity." Micah 5:2. Melchizedek served as a high priest of the Most High God because he had loved righteousness and hated iniquity. God made him a son, S-O-N, and anointed him with the oil of gladness above his brethren. Hebrews 1:9. The word anointed is the Greek word kreo, which refers to contact between one being anointed and the other doing the anointing. The Greek word Christos, translated Christ, is derived from the word kreo. It appears that this anointing is the power to be made a king and a priest forever, as was Melchizedek. See Revelations 5:10. We continue reading, this time from the 7th chapter of Hebrews 4-6, speaking of Melchizedek. And I quote, "Now consider how great this person was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of his spoils. Truly, the sons of Levi, who have received the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose genealogy is not counted from them received tithes from Abraham, and he blessed him who had the promises." In Hebrews 7:14 it says, "It is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning the priesthood." Hebrews 7 verse 7. And without any contradiction, the less is blessed by the greater. Melchizedek continued to be a mystery even in the New Testament period after the death of Jesus. Among the first generation apostolic fathers, there were certain individuals who considered Melchizedek as divine. One who promoted this was called Theolatus II, for the want of a better identification. Teaching on Hebrews, he said the only other divine being besides the Father was the Spirit, who was identified as the Son. It was the Holy Spirit that appeared to Abraham and the priest Melchizedek. Hippolytus stood against this, claiming they worship Melchizedek. This is possibly true, as Harnack states in his book, History of Dogma. It certainly is not out of the reach of possibility, since they considered Melchizedek divine. Most who believe Melchizedek was Christ use the scripture Hebrews 7:3 to support their argument. And I quote, "Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life," unquote. They use the word made, like in the Greek, meaning to make a facsimile, to produce a model or copy. Not that he was a son, like S-O-N, son. The idea is that no human being could be without father or mother, having no beginning days or end of life. This idea comes from the Greek words apator, amenator, or age in illogitos, translated without father, without mother, without recorded genealogy. This could mean, if interpreted as such, as being of divine origin, meaning he was without human origin. Our versions of the Bible come from the Greek. Another way to look at this is that the author is stressing the point that there is no record of his ancestry, meaning that there is no information biblically or orally pertaining to who he was or his lineage. These scholars who hold this view are people like Matthew Henry, F.F. Bruce, Gleason Archer, Louis F. Choffer, and Dr. Arnold Frechenbaum. And there's many more as well. I always like to turn to the dictionary. Unger's Bible Dictionary states that Melchizedek was without father. It refers to his priestly genealogies. Melchizedek is not found on the register of the only line of legitimate priest. No record of his name is there. His father's name is not recorded, nor his mother's, nor evidence points to this line of descent from Aaron. It is not affirmed that he had no father, that he was not born at any time or died in any day, but that these facts are nowhere found in the register of Levitical priesthood. Then there is one last history in the book of Philo. Remember, Philo was born in 20 BC and died in 50 AD. He was a Jew living in Alexandria and knew Melchizedek well. In his book 25, verses 79 through 82, it says something. Abraham does not worship Melchizedek, which is consistently done in previous appearances of angels of the Lord. What we do find is this priest offering bread and wine, giving a type of communion service which predates the Passover commemoration. And for a Jew to admit that this particular event predates the Passover commemoration is a huge acknowledgement. We would now like to try and compare Melchizedek to perhaps another character in history after the time of Melchizedek. Perhaps the biggest problem we have in our day, understanding the characters from history, is that we have allowed archaeologists to write our history for us. What are they doing writing history? The most noted example is in the broad separation of epochs of time categorized by these archaeologists by what the tools of the people were made of. The Bronze Age leaves us with the impression that all the people on the planet were different after bronze became the metal of choice. Later, during the Iron Age, the world changed as if the people of the Bronze Age were taken from the earth and replaced by these people who used iron. Nothing could be sillier. What about the religions of these people? Did their religions change with the metal they used for their tools? Doesn't it make a great deal more sense to classify people based on their fundamental beliefs and values rather than the metal they use to eat their soup? Then there are the archaeologists who classify whole generations, whole historical peoples based on the shape of their pottery. Somehow these historians in our day, to them it makes more sense to talk about the people who built Stonehenge based on the narrow fluke at the top of their earthenware jars than it does to speak about their religions and their beliefs. These historians suggest that when the people of Holland came down from the British Isles, that the entire population changed. Why don't they discuss the fact that the most significant migration into the British Isles came from the lost tribes of Israel? The Celts, who contained many of the lost tribes of Israel from the time of the Assyrian conquest. These Celts of Great Britain had once been the foes of the earliest Romans in the Po Valley around 400 BC and been chased out of there and settled in the protected islands of the sea called Great Britain today. These Celts had the blood of Hebrews flowing through their veins and the basic beliefs of the house of Israel, which included the stories of Melchizedek. Who cares what shape their pottery was? When the Celts had arrived in Great Britain, they were met by the self-imposed exiles from the Trojan Wars or the Greeks. The British still called themselves today the Brutes because it was Brutus who had fallen from Troy who had settled in Great Britain by the time the Celts had arrived. The Greeks brought with them the tales of Homer, who wrote the epic poem Jason and the Golden Fleece. What was the Golden Fleece? Why didn't Jason in his arduous voyages seek for a cache of golden bars or golden coins or precious stones? What was the golden ram skin? Why was it so critical to the Greeks? One of the greatest mergers in all time came when these same tribes mixed with the Greeks about the time of Homer, and he wrote his poem. The Golden Fleece was reported to be a garment that had the power to protect entire nations and bind covenants between people. Amazingly, the most famous Golden Fleece in history was the robe of the temple worn by none other than Melchizedek 1,000 years before Homer. His robe looked like the robes of Eastern Orthodox Christian priests today, and certainly the robe supposedly worn by Merlin the magician. The front panel that was worn was much like a poncho, like in Mexico, the way they wear it. And it was also worn by King Arthur himself. Only the one King Arthur had a huge red cross on the front. King Arthur lived just at the time when the Romans had decided to abandon the Isles of Great Britain and withdrew, leaving the locals to defend themselves from the marauding Saxons. This was before St. Augustine, before he was sent to Britain to convert them to Christianity. However, when he got there, they were already Christians and had been for hundreds of years. Across the islands to the west, St. Patrick, who was sent to Ireland to convert the Irish to Christianity, wrote to the Pope to say that this was certainly the easiest conversion in the history of the world. These people already believed in Jesus. They had a form of the Bible. They practiced the Eucharist. They believed in the commandments of Moses. St. Maur said in 280 AD, when he was asked by Caesar to mop up the rebellious barbarians in Spain and France, that the dead on the battlefield had crosses around their necks. And there was other evidence that made them obviously Christians. When he refused to kill his brethren Christians anymore, he was beheaded by Caesar. But not until after he wrote the codes of chivalry that were eventually used by King Arthur 250 years later. To Rome, it must have been a surprise that anyone else was practicing Christianity before they, because they actually thought they were the first to do so and owned the legacy of Jesus. This people in Great Britain obtained their religion from the merchant of Alban, or Joseph of Arimathea, who had owned the Mendip mines in England and contributed to the great existing university just after the death of Christ. However, Great Britain had already been an ancient home for the Old Testament prophets long before the time of the arrival of Joseph of Arimathea. In the book, The 12 Heights of Glastonbury, Joseph of Arimathea is given 12 separate 160-acre parcels of ground when he arrived in Great Britain with his famous little group. What king would give a stranger 2,000 of acres of ground on an island? There must have been a reason. The fact of the matter is that there were many reasons for giving Joseph of Arimathea the ground in question. None of those reasons had anything to do with the metal of his weapons or his tools or the shape of his pottery. If it had anything to do with the value of the metal, the king would not have given Joseph of Arimathea the 2,000 acres to begin with. He would have kept it for himself and allowed Joseph to sell the metal from the mine in his behalf. In our day, The excavations from Pompeii and Herculaneum have analyzed the tin and lead used by the citizens who were buried by the volcano Mount Vesuvius around 70 AD. The lead had a fingerprint identification factor, a mineral impurity always present when metal is refined. It had been mined in England from the men-dipped mines of Joseph of Arimathea. There, frozen in history, the evidence that Joseph of Arimathea was doing trade traffic with Pompeii and Herculaneum. The King of England didn't give 2,000 acres to a stranger. He gave it to a man who represented the most cherished belief in their country. This was the legacy of the people who revered Melchizedek. In this case, the metal helps us to track down the influence of Joseph of Arimathea and nothing more. It was their beliefs that was so important to these kings of Great Britain. It was the reason why they were so generous to Joseph of Arimathea when he got there. Now we can begin looking for traces in history of where perhaps Melchizedek came and went. Centuries ago, Godfrey of Monmouth, in his History of the Kings of Britain, said something very interesting. He said, now many years and many kings had come and gone. Merlin the Briton was famous throughout the world as king and prophet. He was the lawgiver to the proud South Wales, and he foretold the future to their leaders. Merlin the Enchanter is one of the most interesting characters in Arthurian legend. Before Godfrey, the character is thought to have been an English bard, Merlin. Godfrey would have Latinized the term, a change that would have made it similar to the French word merde, meaning fecal material. Therefore, in order to be decent, the author modified the name slightly and changed it to Merlin. You see, Merlin is probably not based solely on this one bard that Godfrey had mentioned. He is more likely the composite of several well-known bards, of which Merlin is but one. You see, the legends of Merlin span many lifetimes as if he were someone undead. He comes, he goes, he suddenly appears, then he's gone again. The earliest of these composite figures is mentioned in Anarins the Gottadin in 600 to 900 AD. In section 43 it reads, 3 Bristol boars bent on destruction. Morian carried off with his spear. Marathon the song, sharing the best part of our wealth and support. Now the spear they're talking about is likely the spear of Cassius Longinus, the spear that lands the side of Jesus, the spear that Cassius Longinus carried on his person when he got on the boat of Joseph of Arimathea and went with him into exile with the Virgin Mary, the Bethany sisters, Mary Magdalene, the little child Joses, who was the son of the Virgin Mary. All of them went to Great Britain. This spear became a relic, a holy relic. This spear became associated with protection of peoples. They carried it into battle with them. The rumor was that if you carried this spear, your country would not suffer defeat. Napoleon had it. Hitler had it. Many different people had it throughout history. When they lost possession of it, within days, these regimes fell. There was another composite Merlin. This is the bard Lailoquin, who was mentioned in the 12th century work Life of Saint Kentigern. We must pause for a moment to assess the overall picture of what history is trying to tell us. I was recently told by one of the list members that paganism is the root of all Christianity. My retort was that Christianity, or Messianic spiritualism, is really the root of all paganism. I am reminded the last 2 verses of the Old Testament where Malachi says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to the fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. First,
Elijah was also one who was reported to have never tasted death, as was the promise to Melchizedek. Secondly, it becomes apparent that the prophet Malachi is trying to tell us that we must look back in time and retrieve the dogma of our fathers, and they must help us retrieve it, or the earth will be cursed. We are the generation of forgetfulness. We are not the only ones to have forgotten in history. We are not the only ones to have forgotten our roots. By the time of the Nicene Council, 300 years after the death of Christ, the surviving apostolic fathers under Constantine couldn't even remember the very nature of God himself. This is evidence from the Nicene Creed, which generalized the nature of God so completely that it had lost all meaning and certainly had distanced itself from the God of the people of Jesus, the God that Jesus knew so well, that his people had grown to understand. See John 10:34 for the words of Jesus on that very topic. In our day, paganism has also become a religion of those who have forgotten their roots. However, embedded in their tales and traditions are the vines connecting them to a Christian messianic origin. It is the nature of men to forget where they come from and the meaning and values of their fathers. Malachi's words should not fall on deaf ears. It's easy to remember tradition that doesn't require of us any specific behavior. It is easy to point fingers at the past and draw critical parallels which exonerate the skeletons in our own closets. The more responsible traditions are often found amongst the lonely amongst us, the isolated amongst us, who bear the cross for the reasons of their own. These are the traditions that are hard to pass from generation to generation because the children just do not want to be burdened. I have asked myself, why is it so hard to see this other perspective? Why is it so easy to assume that we began as godless barbarians and then evolved into sophisticated, dogma-ridden followers of Jesus? The Romans made the same mistake when the Caesars kept sending their generals to Spain, France, and England to mop up the godless barbarians. It began to backfire on them when in 280 AD, St. Maurice found that these so-called barbarians carried the symbol of the cross of Jesus around their necks. They had a version of the Bible. They practiced the Eucharist and baptism. They had clear stories of Jesus and the Old Testament prophets. St. Maurice concluded that these weren't barbarians at all, but were rather his brothers in Christ. And he refused to finish the genocide of the Caesars. St. Augustine was sent to convert the barbarians of England to Christianity, and St. Patrick was sent to convert the barbarians of Ireland to Christianity. Both were surprised to find these barbarians practicing Christianity. In the words of St. Patrick, all they were lacking was the Vatican. In our day, we clearly think that the ancient Druids were pagans because the Druids of our day are pagan. Perhaps we have forgotten as much of our Christian history as the Druids had forgotten about their origins as well. D.J. Conway said in 1990, the Druids were the Celtic priesthood in the beginning until the Romans and other patriarchal religions forced a change. Douglas Munro in his book, The Lost Books of Merlin, said, by the time the doctrines of Druidism were beginning to be written down by Christian monks, the pure tenets of the priesthood had long been either distorted or lost to memory. In the prophecies of Merlin it reads, and a boar of Cornwall shall come forth and crush their necks under his feet. Cornwall being the location where Joseph of Arimathea landed in exile, carrying the Virgin Mary with him and all of her company to the shores of Britain in the Exodus of the Faithful in 36 AD. Now we must look for the fingerprints which connect Druidism with Christian roots and especially with Melchizedek. The greatest of all the Druid gods was the green god of the woods, who was reported to have been a watcher. They had other watchers in their traditions as well, most notably the watchers of the north, south, east, and west. These were the underworld guardians of humanity. It almost sounds like something out of the Wizard of Oz. However, curiously, the term watcher is a fingerprint key. Watcher is a very specific term indeed. It was especially used at the time of Enoch to describe the other humanoids, not sons of Adam and Eve, who married the daughters of Eve before the flood of Noah. It was Enoch who reportedly ordained Melchizedek to be a king, priest, and prophet. This is no coincidence. The terms are too unique. It is also no coincidence that 2 of the 9 lords of judgment for the Druids were named Enoch or Enoch and Amara or Armana of Egyptian fame at the time of Akhenaten and Moses, Armana being the site of the great temple, much like that of Solomon. Other curious prominent Druids bear the names of Philip, who had visited Britain, sent by James to perform a mission in the West after the death of Christ, and Tomos, the oak, or Thomas, the apostle. Most convincing is that the Druids had broken the year down into 9 months of 45 days each. The first Gilgal, the stag of 7 tines, is the month of the birth of the divine child. The second Gilgal, the flame of Montrona, divine mother of Mabon, is the protectress of the divine child. The third Gilgal, the raven, bringer of destiny into the world, represents the fate of the divine child. The fourth Gilgal, the flowers of mathematics, bringer of beauty into the world. It is the instiller of beauty in the divine child. The fifth Gilgal, the red dragon of Arthur, bringer of victory and material accomplishment into the world. This is the month of nobility and bravery in the divine child. The sixth Gilgal is the eagle of Lu, symbol of the fruits of one's labors, granter of rewards to the divine child. The seventh Gilgal, the cauldron of Taliesin, is the bringer of self-transformation. This month remembers the teacher of self-accomplishment to the divine child. The eighth Gilgal is the head of Bran, the greatest of the Druids, bringer of safe passage out of the world. This is the month of the initiator of the divine child. And lastly, the ninth Gilgal, the hounds of Aun, the drivers of destiny before mankind, the holy son of the new year. These Druid peoples had a thirst for learning and had for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They had organized the Druid corps or colleges. They were anything but barbarians. Rome had sent many of its chosen sons to study in England, not the least of which was Constantine, the father of our Western Christianity, and Pontius Pilate, and his mentor Lucius Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect of Tiberius Caesar. There were 9 courses of study in their universities. This was very useful to the royal Caesars. We know that these so-called Druid barbarians traveled the world. Buried in the Gobi deserts along the silk trade routes from west to east are mummies of red-haired Brits dressed in their tartans. These mummies wore multicolored tartans, symbolic of the coat of Joseph, who was sold into Egypt by his brothers in the Old Testament. Jeremiah had brought the Ark of the Covenant to Britain. The Ark was once known to have contained the bones of that very same Joseph who had been sold into Egypt, who had worn the garment of many colors. These mummies were often buried with their staff. The staff of the ancients in both Britain and the land of the Hebrews were not only for walking, but contained powers, like the staff of Moses or the rod of Aaron. That too was contained in the fabled Ark of the Covenant. Many of these staffs were carved with the stories of their ancestors, and these staffs helped them to recite the traditions of their fathers and their genealogy. From the ancient Druid book of Pharelt we read, and I quote, "In the year 59 since the Christ, Tacitus appointed royal chronicler to the governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinius sent to England to record the triumph of the Roman legions over the Druid barbarians. He records a conversation with one of the conquered Druids. Tacitus asks, "Who are you?" The old man lowered himself back onto the ground and closed his eyes with an almost disappointed sigh. "Who am I, you ask?" And he took another deep breath as if preparing for something. "I have been in many forms before coming to be in this one. I am counsel to the High King through whom the order of the starry heavens exist." Could this man have been Melchizedek? He went on to tell the story of Bran the giant who lived before the flood and ruled Great Britain. Bran the giant was one of the watchers at the time of Enoch. Could he have known Melchizedek?
This red dragon became associated early with fighting dragons imprisoned by Lune and Lepheles. The significance of these dragons was pointed out by Merlin, the Merlin of Archaeology legend. The dragons, one white, the evil dragon, one red, the good dragon, had fought for many years. The white dragon at first prevailed, but in the end, the red dragon overcame the white. Merlin explained that the Welsh would ultimately, after a long period of adversity, overcome the foreign Norseman white dragon invaders and maintain their language, lands, and freedom. Maybe Merlin was Melchizedek. Maybe he was Taliesin as well.
Taliesin, the bard, claimed to be another one of those people who did not die. Taliesin said, "I am he who peeped forth from the unhewn dolmen arch." It is reported that even Jesus peeped through that arch in his mortal visits to England, the homeland of his grandmother, the great St. Anna. The term unhewn stones is another fingerprint connecting the Druids with the Old Testament. See Exodus 20:25. God said to Moses that the altars made of hewn stones were polluted. Is that the reason for the unhewn stones at Stonehenge and other places where they clearly had the technology to cut stones? He, Taliesin, claimed to have been a witness for Jesus. Very strange. Taliesin then said, "And now I have come here to the remnant of Troia, or Troy," which makes sense because the Trojans were surely Celtic. And they often fought naked and sometimes cut off the heads of their enemies with the sword of their enemies in remembrance of David killing Goliath with Goliath's own sword. They wore a coat of many colors, plaid like the British tartans, because they remembered the prophecy about Joseph and his coat of many colors. The many-colored coat separated the kings from the priests. The kings wore many colors at the same time, but the priest wore a single pure color. When a king tries to offer incense in the temple with his coat of many colors, it was considered leprous as snow. Both the Druid and the Hebrew had the tree of life in their lore. Irish and Hebrew look an awfully lot alike. Both have the word Beth for 5. The main idea of both gods was an omnipresent one. King Arthur fought for 3 days and nights with a cross over his shoulder and defeated the Saxons in 12 major battles. The red dragon had prevailed. The Old Testament said that God would scatter Israel and they would worship false gods that their fathers knew not, and women would rule over them, etc. The Druids were famous for their warrior women dressed in black. But he, God, said he would not completely take away the blessing of Israel. And he didn't. Because by the time those white dragon, Viking, Saxon, Woden-worshipping, Valhalla-bound Norsemen, Jute, Danish, Vandal Huns were finished, we already had Jeremiah and Joseph of Arimathea, and Jesus and his whole family arrived in England. The Norsemen believed a wolf would eat their great god Woden in the end, the doom of Ragnarok. The Norsemen believed that the chaos giants would take over England and Wales in the end. The high kings of Hibernia, or Hibernia, Ireland, read the Torah at Tara and crowned their 2 kings on Lephal, the stone Jeremiah brought with him, which became known as Jacob's pillar. Now the whole mishmash is called Britain because of the death-worshipping Vikings, Normans of William the Conqueror, and everyone else submitted to the winsomeness of Jesus, as did the Roman Empire. Paul was right. The Gentiles were worshipping demons, and they couldn't stand, because for this reason did Jesus come, to destroy the works of the devil. Even Iceland's king just told everybody he was going to the top of some mountain to meditate and pray. And when he came down, he said, "It's Jesus. There is hope." There were no religious wars that marred the transition to Christianity in Iceland. To this day, the kings of England insist upon crowning their monarchy on that stone that Jeremiah brought on the ship. If William or Charles ever become king, just look where their foot will be. Same stone that was under the Israeli throne. Same stone Moses struck on the desert. Same pillow that Jacob slept on. Merlin had to be Melchizedek, or someone pretty intense. In the journal Reflections of John Henry, Cardinal Newman, who lived from 1801 to 1890, the Catholic priests were the ones to chronicle the history of England. Cardinal Newman noted the similarity between Merlin and Melchizedek. He said, both without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. And then he wrote, "Thrice blessed are they who feel their loneliness, fatherless, homeless, reft of age and place, severed from the earth, and careless of its wreck. Born through the long woe, he, his rare Melchizedek." In the end, the greatest evidence of them all is that the worldwide fraternity, the order of the druids, who were once the wise men for the royal family, members of emperors, kings, pharaohs, Caesars, all over the world for millennium, were the magi, the Latin term for druid, who were among the few who visited the birth of the Messiah, Jesus. They knew the truth of Jesus when the Jews did not. They brought a king's ransom of gold, frankincense, and myrrh with them. They knew the gift